dear viewers and listeners who are out there in Padcost land.
Well done, you.
Welcome to the latest episode of Extra Extra. It's all about whiskey. I remain your host, Jason Johnson Yellen. He remains Joshua Morrissey Hatton. And in each episode, we bring about a whiskey story. We discuss it, we chat, we riff. And when it's not Passover, we have a little whiskey tasting as well. So today, not Passover, so we will have a little whiskey tasting going on later in today's episode. But to begin, Joshua, before we hit record, I said to you, I just need you to trust me today. And you said...
What did I say? Oh, I said, trust you? Yeah.
You said, where we're going, we don't need roads.
And then I grabbed a banana peel and like half a can of Coke or something like that and just popped it into my flux capacitor Cuisinart and away we went.
And away we went. The episode started recording immediately after that. That would be a good thing to include, but we didn't have our laptops, so it wasn't going to work.
Well, what you told me is that you had a surprise topic. And I said that I'm very excited. So here we are, Jason's surprise topic.
That's some random capitalization in that topic. Wow, look at that.
No, you have to capitalize excite. That's not random. Excite. That's very purposeful.
Very excite.
Yeah, okay.
Just capitalize the whole damn thing. And so here we are at Extra Extra. And I'm looking around the whiskey world and I'm seeing South Korean millennials and older Gen Zers have increased first quarter imports of whiskey, UK and US.
Okay.
You know, it's a big story, right? I'm seeing Hamza Yusuf, who is the new First Minister of Scotland, getting ready to talk to the British Prime Minister and saying, look, let's be kind to duty. Let's go easy here. Let's take care of the people of Scotland. The SWA joining in, similar things.
Nice. Okay.
I'm seeing Bob Dylan opening a distillery in Kentucky to go along with his Heaven's Gate brand. I'm seeing Elvis Whiskey launching a peanut butter flavor whiskey, right?
Peanut butter and banana?
I'll be honest.
Constipation?
I'll be honest. I didn't click beyond the headline because I didn't want to know the answer. Yeah. But here's what I was thinking to myself. You and I were deep into a whiskey conversation on Friday. So before the weekend started, here we are on the other side, recording this on the other side of the weekend. We were deep in a whiskey conversation. And I was thinking to myself, our listeners are whiskey drinkers. And you and I thought we're having a conversation about something that is pertinent to whiskey drinkers. So while the South Korea story is a big one, and we'd be having a fine time talking about it, and while the potential increase on duty in the UK for whiskey is potentially a big one, or we could get into, we've touched on it before, which is celebrity endorsements and what that means for whiskey. There was one tiny story from last week that I thought would be a good jumping off point for us to return to the conversation we were having just between the two of us at the end of last week.
Okay.
And the story in the spirits business was about Weems launching a blended malt. You and I were having a very real conversation. Again, just between the two of us, like no cameras, no recording, no audience. We were just chatting about this and what we thought. And I thought that would be a great conversation for us to return to and actually get it on wax or on video, whatever the medium happens to be.
Okay.
So let me frame this, just since we're using the Weems piece as a jumping off. There's 3,000 bottles of this blended malt, and it was finished in Madeira casks. And I want to begin where you and I were the other day, which is, do you see a future for blended malt? What do you think the current lay of the land is for blended malt? I will also say the reason I want us to cover this in extra is I would seriously like to hear from the viewers in the YouTube comments below. Because one of the things you and I were trying to get at the heart of the other day was, is there an audience? Where are consumers on this? What are consumers thinking about this? So please, 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 comments below. Joshua, my question to you remains, what do you think? What are you seeing in the world of blended malt?
You know, I was thinking about that conversation over the weekend and trying to wrap my head around what I actually thought and how I think it would play out. Because what do I actually think? I do actually think that we will see more and more blends, be they blended malts or just blended Scotch whiskey, so malt and grain. And I think that's an inevitable thing. And I was trying to parse out what that would look like because consumers don't come to it, right? Companies have to make it. Companies have to assign their marketing teams tasks to get the consumer excited about the idea of blended malt. And so there are many scenarios in which I think this could work. Here's how I thought about it. Now, sometimes I like to connect dots, and sometimes those dots are quite far from one another, and sometimes they're a little close. You would call that tortured, and I would just say, well, just follow me. Just follow me. James.
I would call it tortured. That is well said, sir.
Well, I was thinking back to 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. I could have the dates wrong. But it was around the time, that Impex started bringing in whiskeys from Oishi and Fukano. And until that happened, the idea of a rice whiskey made no sense to anyone. In fact, if you rewound the clock to the early 2000s, people would say, what, Japanese whiskey? What is that, made from rice? And they would say it in the pejorative. We've brought this up many times. My point is, since 2016, 2017, here we are in 2023, on the heels of Oishi and Fukano, there are a few dozen different rice or rice and barley or, different types of grain whiskeys coming in from Japan that are also produced with koji in the fermentation. And we're seeing it more and more. We're seeing it so much that even Buffalo Trace has started to experiment with koji in some of their experimental distilling. We know there's some distilleries all around the U.S. that are playing with koji and rice. Even Buffalo Trace used rice, white rice, red rice. And so my point is, years ago, I thought it would be Compass Box paving the way. And I would argue Compass Box paved a ton of the way. But seemingly over the past 20 years or so, they seem to be a singular voice in doing that.
Strangely, right?
Right. And I think now we're seeing more and more. Your example of Weems, I think, is a great one. There's other brands that are bringing on their own blends. Even Johnny Walker brought back Johnny Walker Green, which is their blended malt. Granted, that was a couple years ago or whatever. My point is, when we thought Compass Box was going to be the savior of blends, they weren't. Granted, they definitely made a name. They got the whiskey dorks comfortable. But now more and more people are coming into the fold, releasing their own blends. So I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to take this group of people, this ever-growing group of people, to make it happen, to get the consumers excited. part of the thing that interests me the most about it, and maybe this was part of your intention with this conversation, maybe it wasn't, but part of my interest is not in how they're going to do it. It's in the why they're doing it in the first place.
Okay. Continue.
Well, I've been thinking about that. Why? It's more and more you're seeing it now. Again, I'll throw on the Impex cap one more time after Oishi and Fukano, and I'll say, under the Glenallachie banner, you've got the McNair's, which is a blended malt. You've got White Heather, which is a blend, so malt and grain. And then the Adelphi folks, Ardmarken Distillery, just launched their McLean's Nose, which is a high malt content sherry cask, West Coast style blended whiskey. And they'd been doing blends for a while, blending Scotch whiskey with Japanese whiskey and doing all sorts of like cool experiments. This is a big thing for them though. And as I'm seeing more and more of these distilleries doing this, I wonder if, and again, maybe this is one of my tortured connections, Jason, I wonder if any of this is connected to the overall costs to single malt and the growing costs to single malt. What have blends been for many people? They have been the stepping stone to single malts. And if single malts have become that aspirational bottle, even even some of your flagship bottlings.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
If $65 is an aspirational dollar amount, wouldn't 30, 35 be a nice entry point into a category? And so I partially wonder if that is the reasons for this, the reason for the season, if you will.
Which brings me back to my comment about consumers, which is if you're a producer and you bring something to a consumer that has the right price, is there excitement from a consumer there? And one of the things you and I have been discussing about blended malts and blended scotches is how are you selling it? How are you presenting it to a consumer so that it does become exciting and does become a product that a consumer wants to put in their mouth?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, and looking over the Weems piece, right? The tasting notes sound magnificent, right?
Sure,
like let me just give you a very quick blast here, right? The whiskey boasts aromas of sun-baked peaches, dried apricot, and succulent nectarines on the nose, while the palate presents orange oil, sumptuous rich vanilla, and caramelized sugar. The finish rounds off with spices, toasted saffron, like never seen that in a tasting note, and crystallized ginger. And so as a consumer, I'm thinking, oh, shit, I want to taste that. Like that sounds like it's 46%, it's a blended malt, but gosh, those sound like great flavors. And then they go, okay, and it's 55 pounds a bottle.
Oh,
and then they put in the dollar equivalent, but it's not going to be what the bottle would be going for in America. So I'm not actually going to use it. But that 55 pounds a bottle, we know 35, 40 pounds a bottle will get you something pretty kick-ass from another producer, maybe a Douglas Lang or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
Right, in the UK, you're in that kind of territory, and so I'm just thinking what it would be like to be at a tasting, being the one presenting that, and saying, here's the bottle, here's the label. It's got this lovely, beautiful orange hue to it. It then fits with the tasting notes. And then you get the delivery on that. And what's my new go-to? I've spoken for years about my tasting society on the Palouse. For years having Lafroig 10 cask strength at $35 be their go-to. Not the case anymore. Lafroig 10 cask strength is still their go-to, but it's not $35. But if you're going to present me with a blended malt, it's going to have to be pretty kick-ass because I'm going to be thinking about my Compass box Glasgow blend, right? Great King Street Glasgow blend. Now, yes, there is some grain in that. Yes, that helps the pricing at $35 a bottle. I feel like once you get into the world of price points, I think that can be a very scary realm in which to inhabit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting when you said 55 pounds for the Weems blended malt. My initial reaction, without thinking, was, seems a bit high. But quite often, people will use a dollar amount as an indication of quality, right? The more it costs, the better it's got to be, right? So are they going after that crowd? Does that debunk what I was saying before, where blends are your entry point into whiskey? Now, granted, part of me, I had the Glasgow's blend, the Compass Box blend in mind because it's $35 a bottle.
Yep.
But I also, again, I'm probably gonna throw the Impex hat on a few times in this conversation.
But that was part of our conversation the other week, so I'm totally cool with it.
But it makes me think of McLean's Nose, which is the name of the Ardnamurchan blend or the Adelphi blend, and that's going to be $35 a bottle, 46%. Far more malt than grain, sherry cask, and I'm thinking, well, damn, that is a fine price. Man, I'm trying to remember the question you threw at me, but
well, let me ask you this:
go ahead.
while you've got the Impex hat on, how much is a bottle of Ardnamurchan single malt in America? And I know it varies by state, but what's your ballpark?
It's going to vary by state, but you're looking at around 60-ish, 65-ish, somewhere around there, right?
The reason I asked the question is because as we're having this conversation, I'm trying to unpack your earlier claim, and I'm trying to work out whether blended Scotch is an entry, and I'm wondering if a consumer meets McLean's Nose and they go, okay, there's Ardnamurchan in here, and there's a good amount of malt in here. They're thinking, I enjoyed that at $35. Is that consumer thinking about their next step? Are they thinking about, okay, if I add on 30, I get a single malt, and that's all Ardnamurchan? Is that going to be a partnership? Right? Is that going to be a pairing of purchase?
Yeah, I just don't know that it works that way. A $35 bottle is on the high end for people who go into a bar and say, "Give me a Scotch on the rocks." That is on the high end, but it's not unattainable. And I think the idea behind presenting a bottle for the people who say, "Give me a Scotch on the rocks," and they try that and they like it, the idea isn't, well, geez, I liked that, and that was 70% malt, and they're not thinking that way. They're thinking, I liked this. And then they're going to go to their cousin's house on Memorial Day or on Guy Fawkes Day or whatever, insert holiday here, and their cousin's going to have they're going to have a Glenlivet, they're going to have a Longmore, and they're going to have insert a single malt here, and they'll say, oh man, there's this Scotch I've been having. I wonder if I'll like this. And then they taste that. Maybe it's a step up, maybe it isn't, depending on their palate. But typically, people find single malts to be that step up, that increase of like flavor. And so I think that's the way producers view a lower cost blend, is not how they're deconstructing it. It's make something really good that brings them into the next step. So less deconstruction and more of an organic appreciation into the next step up.
It also seems like you're saying it's it's a step into a category across the category. It's not necessarily a vertical integration into a distillery.
Correct. Yeah, across a category.
Which is then interesting. Do you think it goes the other direction? Do you think somebody who loves Ardnamurchan single malt might look at the Ardnamurchan blend differently?
Oh, I sure as hell would. Oh, without a doubt. Because I'm going to have that bottle on my shelf, and if I'm having company over, people I know don't really appreciate whiskey. Now I've got a much less expensive bottle to be pouring, and if it's just a crowd pleaser, then it doesn't matter, right? It's like good whiskey is good whiskey. I don't need to be pouring my $100 bottle of X to someone because to them it's just good whiskey. They're not going to differentiate between this good whiskey and that good whiskey. In a social setting where you've got a glass and conversation is the focal point and not whiskey.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I'm also curious, and this again comes from something you and I have talked about previously, which is we think there's a natural hesitation amongst single malt, single cask drinkers for blended malt. And I think we can safely say there's a portion of the nation who have embraced single cask blended malts that we have put out, right? Our Isla blended malt just absolutely crushed because it says Isla front and center, right?
Yep.
And it was crazy delicious. So again, we're always talking about these individual pockets of consumers, and they may not even exist in the consumer world. But we think there's a natural hesitancy with blended malts, with that title. Do you think that will go away? Do you think there's a way for that to go away? Do you see that softening? There's a good word for you. Do you see that softening?
Look at you with words. It's an interesting point. You know, we talk about I was going to say the industry being cyclical, but I think the world is cyclical. But it can be difficult to be looking backwards. So what I'm trying to say is up until the 80s, it really was the 80s that brought out single malt as the next step up. And once the Scotch whiskey industry did that, I wouldn't say there was no turning back. I mean, blends still absolutely still dominate, right? It's still 88-90% of the overall sale of Scotch whiskey. But I would argue those that just drink a blend, that just want Scotch on the rocks, have an understanding in the back of their heads that Macallan 12, that's the aspirational one, right? Or Dalmore, whatever, right? And so even though those that just stick with blends may continue to stick with blends, they have this understanding that single malt is really, that's the elitist whiskey, if you will. My point is, before that, it was blends was where it was at. I remember having a conversation with Chris Mabin, years ago, and Chris Mabin, who's now with Elixir, he was with Compass Box, and he gave us a history. He was on our podcast, and he talked about how blends were considered the elite whiskey. That's where it was at, and you respected the blender for creating that luscious yet soft, gentle whiskey, because malt was for the Highlands Scots people. Those are for the animals up there, while we English folk enjoy this soft blend. You know what I mean? And so, and then when the mid 80s came around and single malt became what single malt is, can we return to something that's close to blends being a bit more sought after. I don't know that we can get there given this modern sort of internet age, but I think we can get to a point where maybe a percentage point or two more can come back to blended. Whew, that was a tough series of words to string together.
I think you pulled it off, though. I'm not even going to throw around the word tortured. I think you pulled that off. But it does come back to something you were saying earlier, and I liked it when you brought up about the Koji rice whiskey coming in, Oishi Fukano coming in, because part of our conversation previously was the success of marketing and the successful marketing of single malts and of age statements. And I feel like there's some unpacking to do around blended malts, right? And there's this, you asked this very question, right? Why did you do it? Why did you want to bring this blended malt or blended scotch to the marketplace? And I think there's one leaning, which is, oh, it was a delightful set of flavors and they wanted me to taste these flavors. And there's another leaning that says, oh, they wanted to offer me a cheaper product that I would go to a store and pick up. And maybe it's both. I'm learning this as I get older. Maybe it's both, right? It doesn't need to be one or the other. But there needs to be some backing behind blended malt, even blended scotch, and what can be done in that category. And we're back to this word again. Stories need to be told, but not, again, marketing bullshit stories, but genuine flavor, taste stories, right? Maybe some history. Maybe here's where this category used to be. Here's a category we can return to and dip a toe back into. Was it, and I'm trying to think while I'm asking the question, was it the case that distilleries would be known at the same time for a blended malt or a blended scotch? Because I'm leaning towards probably not, right?
Can you rephrase that question?
Yeah, so I'm playing around with this idea that here comes Ardnamurchan, and Ardnamurchan's going to tell us about the Ardnamurchan scotch, blended scotch that contains Ardnamurchan. And I'm trying to think, when there was Ballantine's and there was White Horse, right?
I have a perfect example, Jason.
Yeah, go.
What when you go to the Craigellachie distillery, what's on there?
Indeed, the very large lettering of Doers. Indeed.
Right, and that's them pointing out that Craigellachie plays a massive role in the backbone of their blend. Diageo would highlight Cardew in one of their Johnny Walker labels, right? Johnny Walker 18 famously had Clynelish as the backbone. So I think it is a way for these companies to highlight the malts within their blends.
Interesting.
I think there's a smart way of doing that. And that gets to what you were saying before when you asked the question, is this Ardnamurchan's way of getting the Scotch drinker into Ardnamurchan through their blend? And maybe it is. Maybe that's an entry point. And if Craigellachie is the example, and that's what we're going to be drinking in a little bit.
I was going to say, I think a little bit has become now. Pre-poured. I haven't even been sipping on this as I've been going.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please. I would love for you to ask me a question.
Okay. Did you have something in the chamber you needed to ask me before you handed the reins?
No. I just didn't want us to give up on our current conversation just because we moved on to a single malt.
Oh, no.
So yeah, if you've got a question for me, fire away.
I do. Do you think about the differences between blended malt and blended squash? Blended squash. Have you had any blended squash before?
I do. I actually do. Robinson's Special R, apple and blackcurrant. is a blend of apples and blackcurrants. Absolutely. Yep. You have spoken to a strength of mine, Joshua. This is a good question.
But, in some ways, people will use the word blend in the pejorative no matter what it is. And both you and I you and I know very well that blended malt is often just as good as single malt, sometimes even better than some single malts, and blended scotch can also do magic things. There's no doubt about it. But do you think that there is a strength of blended scotch over blended malt, or vice versa? When it comes to introducing the category of a blend to the consumer, how are they using that to bring the consumer in?
Yeah, I most certainly have an answer ready to go there, because I went up the ladder as a younger gentleman, and now I'm investigating coming down the ladder. And while I was at the top of the ladder, yeah, I was a single malt snob, no doubt about it. Right? I grew up, and I've said this literally a million times. Grew up, glue up. That was Southwest Scotland. If you weren't huffing glue, you were not living.
It was first the blended squash and then the glue?
It's a gateway. Yep. The blended squash is a gateway to the gluing up. Yeah, so I was raised in a blue-collar family. It was plastic jug, cheap as chips, raw gut. Then it became the good blended scotch. That was the aspiration. Nobody was talking blended malts in my family. Nobody. It was the good blended scotches, and then you were into the entry single malts. And once you're in single malts, ooh la la, foie, foie, foie. Boy, were you living a life. And so I most certainly, once I got to Aberdeen University and Whiskey Society and into single malts, thought, oh, I've made it, right? This is where my whiskey journey is meant to get me.
Yeah.
And then from the top of that ladder, taking a little look down and seeing the blended malts and thinking, okay, you are a malt, but you are blended. And then beneath the blended malts, seeing the blended scotches and thinking, there's some grain in you. There's some column still distillate at a young age in you. And so,
wow, really, we're a snob.
100%, absolutely. I wasn't even drinking rum or bourbon or rye, like single malt snob through and through.
Yeah, there you go.
And so, as you rightly said at the beginning of this, compass box, right? It's like, ooh, artisan. Okay, doing something different. I will say, I started out having more interest in blended malts from Compass Box than blended scotches from Compass Box. So I definitely think blended malt still has a higher cachet than blended scotch.
Did an airplane just land in your office there?
Isn't that tremendous? That isn't even that close to me. That's the air brakes of an 18-wheeler coming too hot into a 90-degree turn that Jason, brings it onto my street.
We call that a Jake brake.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard that. Jake brake?
Yeah.
And now it's gone from one straight 90-degree corner. Now it's going down the other straight. I can hear it blasting along. So there we go. Tell you, 18-wheelers and horse and buggies. We see it all here in rural Virginia. So yes, to answer you, Joshua, there is definitely a cachet to blended malt. And I think there is work to be done to then open the doors further for blended scotch. And any time I hear the word blended scotch, I think Johnny Red. And I remember being on a plane. And I was early on in my single malt journey and thinking, oh, this is the bee's knees. This is where I'm meant to be. I remember being on that plane and they didn't have single malt. And so I got a Johnny Red. And I remember having that. And I remember distinctly thinking to myself, this is why we drink single malt, right? It was a completely different experience.
Yep.
Just completely, right? It's like we've always said about the word whiskey being used around the world, and suddenly you go, ooh, I don't like bourbon very much, right? Like, yeah, but bourbon isn't meant to be single malt Scotch, right? It's right. I know they both use the word whiskey. It's a completely different grain bill. It's a completely different process. Yeah. It's a completely different product, right? And I feel like as we move single malt, blended Scotch, I think we're always, right, single malt snobs are looking for, where's the malt in this? What am I drinking? What am I getting? What is my experience?
Yes.
I think that has to be deconstructed and perhaps re-educated.
Right, because there's a certain robustness that the malt brings to the palate that younger grain can't really do, and that's
right.
Then you can have a discussion regarding younger grain and older grain and so on and so forth. But I want to rewind a little bit. I remember years ago, and this may be 10 years ago at this point. This was back when our friend Sammy Simmons was with the Balvenie, and Balvenie had this really cool campaign where they were focusing on craftspeople. And they weren't even looking at whiskey. Like it was just people, making cars and tools, and I don't even remember what.
Yep, shoes.
But shoes and things like that. And what I really enjoyed about that campaign was it had little, if anything, to do with the Balvenie. I mean, it was obvious what it was saying was, hey, and we are craftspeople. We make great whiskey.
Yeah.
But what I liked about it not being directly connected to the Balvenie making their whiskey is it connected to anybody making anything. And it really helped me. And I'd already been familiar with Compass Box for a good while at that point. But it really got me to pay attention more to what John Glaser was doing with his whiskeys and think about where he was coming from when he was producing it, not just what that final product was. And I think that could be a very cool way in which to think about why these blends are what they are, where they're coming from. And I think if you think about it from that standpoint, that thought holds a certain weight. It changes the way you think about that final
Absolutely.
product.
No, I think that's a real smart comment. And it fits so perfectly with my own upbringing, which was blends were something you got away from. You were only drinking blends because that's what you could afford, right?
Yeah.
You wanted to drink whiskey, you afforded the blend, that's what you drank. But back to our last episode of Extra Extra, right? If you had a little bit of extra money floating around, right? Maybe you could treat yourself to a single malt. Holy moly. And then the question became, well, which one and how much would you spend on it? And would it get bang for your buck? And would you be doing it right? And did you know enough? Blah, blah, blah. So to have an entire upbringing that is you only drink blends because that's what you can afford, it's hard to then return to that arena and say, oh, I'm actually here to explore flavor. And I think that's part of the messaging, right?
Yeah. And, I like that. Yep.
Right. And getting away from, oh, they're only offering me this blended malt, blended Scotch because it's cheaper than the rest of their offerings, right? And I think that's the success of John, is it's never felt like John Glaser at Compass Box was offering up something to take money out your pocket. It always, and this could be rightly or wrongly, right? Please comment below. Please write in if you're listening on the podcast. Right? It never felt like he was trying to take money out of my pocket. It always felt like he was playing around with flavors, playing around with options, and saying, all right, here is the expensive stuff. Here is the old grain component. But here's the middle ground stuff. And then, gosh, could I produce something really worth drinking at the $35 price point? Oh, shit. Yeah, I can. Yeah, I pulled that off. And so, again, rightly or wrongly, that's always been my feeling about Compass Box. And I'm sure there were meetings, and it could have been when Bacardi had minority stake in Compass Box, and they were like, "Look, we need something at $35 on a shelf. Could you make that happen tomorrow?" Right? Maybe that was the conversation. Who knows? But I think that's where they've been successful, and it is interesting seeing others trying to come into that realm. The whole time we've been talking, I've been thinking about Woven in Leith. And how are Woven going about this, and what stories are Woven trying to tell? And they've got numbered releases and 50 CL bottles, and you can see how one plays around there with flavors, obviously, components, obviously, but telling a story that's of interest to a consumer who wants to partake in that story with you.
Another great example, and I'm gonna invoke the name of our good friend Ollie Chilton, is the new Elements of Islay range, where you've got 3 core products that are blended Islay malts. And
that's a great addition,
right? And here we are back to what are the reasons for that? I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons for that, but when I say that, I mean creating blended Islay malt, knowing the cost of Islay casks. Like I'm sure there's a monetary reason for that. However, we know Ollie, and we know that he is a chaser of flavor, just like we're a chaser of flavors. And I say this without my Impex hat on. Those new Elements of Islay blended malt are smashing. They are fantastic.
No doubt about it. Yeah,
they're so expertly made and so satisfying for the true Islay fanatic. And I think that, just like plenty of Compass Box examples, just like I'm sure there's many other examples that we're not even thinking of right now, is a good example of blending can be magic. It just can be, right?
Yep. So, if blending can be magic, and if Weems can put blended malt into Madeira and it can be magic, what about the Hanukkah gift that I got you, that we have got in our glasses this day? The Kriegelke 13 with the Armagnac finish, which, again, not... listeners and viewers might actually remember the price tag that we used for this previously, but was this 60, 70, maybe 65 dollars?
65, somewhere around there.
Somewhere around there. This was in the number 20 position, or the number, this was the number 20 in the Whiskey
20?
Advocate top 20. Yeah, I think that's 20. Oh, it's either 19 or 20. It's no higher than those positions. Yep.
Wow. So
my hesitancy, and Indri, I think, came in at 17.
Yeah, Indri came in at 17.
Yeah, this is 19 or 20 position. So, again, along with our conversation from Friday, this was our dram from Friday as well. And you opened your bottle on Friday. And thoughts?
So, and anybody is familiar with the standard Kriegelke 13, and this one is also 13 years of age, by the way. I would argue this is not too different from the standard 13, but where the standard 13 has all of that, first fill wood that's really amplifying the cereal notes, the grain notes, the heaviness to the whiskey. These Armagnac casks are highlighting the fruit. It's you said it before we hit record. It's apricots. It's peach rings. It's like it's candied orange peels. It's all sorts of just light, delicious fruits, and then you get that classic Kriegelke texture, that worm tub texture going on. With just a hint of that phenolic, right? Krugeliki always has that slight phenolic / delicate sulfury note that kind of goes away, somewhere between ages 11 and 13. But when it stays there and it's just that nice little facet, it's awesome. And I couldn't get this song out my head. Whiskey, 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 I made you out of malt. Some people prefer bourbon, but hey, that's not their fault. This is glorious, and I would say I just made that up, by the way.
I could tell. Don't you worry. You don't have to tell us that.
Jason.
Tortured comes back to mind.
Rhymes comes to mind. I would argue that this being at the 20 spot, 20 out of 20, I think is doing it an injustice, because I think this is a remarkable whiskey. And maybe it's just I'm a Krugeliki fetishist. Maybe you're a. What do you think? Do you think 20 is where it should be?
Of course not.
Of course not. It's delicious.
Look.
Yeah,
you and I have tasted the number 1 on that list.
Yep.
You and I have tasted the number 20 on that list. I would invert them in a heartbeat.
In a heartbeat. In it faster than a heartbeat. A nanosecond.
Like what did we say about the Jack Daniels, right? Yeah. Cracking little drinker. Friends come over, pour it for them. No doubt about it. Right? This Krugeliki, people come over and you've got this Krugeliki. Okay, sit down. Pay attention to what I'm about to pour for you. Mm-hmm. Please tell me what you think about it, right? Like it's just a completely different drinking experience. At the same time, as we've talked about through today's chitty chat, which has been everything I hoped for, and I'm watching the clock on the wall. We're getting very close to a tight 35 here.
Very close to 35.
Very close. We got a couple of minutes left. This is everything I want, right? And I'm a single malt snob. Right? However,
yeah.
Look at where we've gone with finishing in the world of single malt. Right? There was a time when finishing had the type of reputation that blended malts and blended scotchies had to the single malt snob. Now we completely accept it. It's just a part of it. Yeah, give me a different flavor. Yeah, add to the lineup. Yeah, give me something else to explore. Give me something else to buy. Right?
To the point where you can be at a festival or at a tasting, or insert scenario where you're pouring whiskey for people here. It's become the vernacular where people like, oh man, I really like the sherry finished ones. I like the Madeira finished ones. I like the rum finished ones. And I find myself more often than not saying, well, actually, that's not a finish. This is a full maturation. Like, oh, wow. Like, but sometimes it's like, oh, wow, they don't even care. They just like the finishing. Like it went from like, oh, finish to like, ooh, a finish.
Yep.
Right. It's and how long did that take?
Yep. 10 years, 15 years. Right.
So how long will this journey of blends take?
But here's a question to get us out of here. And then I'll give some email addresses here. Are you excited to take a blended malt and or blended Scotch journey?
Yes, I am. Because I tie it back to the reason I'm into independent bottlings. I go down the independently bottled whiskey path, just like you do, just like a lot of our viewers and listeners do, because you're searching for those new flavors. And what better way to discover new flavors is by tasting new flavors being developed by blenders, right? They're creating new flavors.
Yeah.
That's kind of special. I think single casks providing a multitude of flavors are accidents. Blending for multitudes of flavors is purposeful, and I kind of like that.
Yep. Yeah, along with the Wovens, we mentioned the Compass Box. Obviously, Weems's blended malt today. I was also thinking for the American side, right? Look at the rise of Barrel, right? Barrel were in that top 20 as well.
100.
Some of the flavors they're bringing together. I was thinking about our own Indiana marriage of bourbon and rye that we did, right? Chasing flavors. And so, yes, to answer my own question, I am excited to take blended malt, blended Scotch journeys to see what flavors are being presented. And if we can do that and save a few pennies in our pockets, gosh, that's all to the better.
That's not so bad. That's not so bad.
Listen, I said at the beginning of the episode, please put your comments below. I really do want to see consumers. You're all consumers like Joshua and I are. What are you consuming? What are you looking for? Is blended malt a bad word? Is blended Scotch a bad word? Talk to us about barrel, right? Are you exploring bourbon rye combinations as well and finishing that's coming into that realm as well? If you're listening on the podcast, you want to get involved as well, you can either send us a note, info@singlecasknation.com. I will be sure to save it as a PDF. Or questions@onenationunderwhiskey.com. And we'll hear from you that way as well. We will, I'm making a promise here, at the start of the next episode of Extra Extra, we are going to circle back to talk about the comments below and any emails that we get. So I really am serious about continuing this conversation.
What should people be doing, Jason?
Smashing that subscribe button below. And apparently ringing the bell.
And ringing the bell. What is ringing the bell? Jason, else. I think that means something completely different.
Smash the button, ring the bell. And then, I don't know, something magical happens? I'm not entirely sure. Listen, we're really cutting it close on a tight 35 today. So thanks to you, Joshua. Thoroughly. That was exactly what I wanted to discuss. Once again, happy Hanukkah on your Craigellachie 13.
Thank you.
Thanks to Roma in New York, who were carrying this and managed to get it to me toot sweet. And I was able to share it with you toot sweet for Hanukkah as well. So sincere thanks to them. And until next time, Joshua, we will get out of here by saying peace.
Peace.